You know, I can't get out of my head Pastor Javon up here singing Do for Love. How many of you would like to hear Pastor Javon after the service today sing Do for Love? First time for everything. We are ready for that first time. Well, earlier this week, my wife Susan and pastors Eric and Mindie went to St. Louis for a church conference. On their way home, they saw this billboard on I-70 and took a little picture on their phone. Real Christians love their enemies. So, obviously, our passage of scripture today is going to be talking about what it means to be a real Christian. And if you don't believe me, call 855-4-TRUTH. They'll clear it all up for you. We're in a series this Lent on the questions Jesus asks. Today's question is, if you love only those who love you, what reward do you have? That's a question of compassion. I imagine most of us, when we think of the word compassion, we think of a tender act of mercy, caring for somebody when they're sick. But let's think about the deeper meaning of the word. The heart of it, obviously, is passion, which comes from a Latin word meaning to suffer. That's why during Lent, especially when we get to Holy Week, we talk about the passion of Jesus, the suffering of Jesus. So compassion is to suffer with. That can have a couple of meanings to it. One is the willingness to suffer with people. That's compassion, the willingness to share other people's pain. But there's another meaning, the willingness to suffer people. The willingness to put up with the suffering other people cause. And it's that second understanding that would have been very foreign and even offensive to people in Jesus' day. Why on earth would you suffer people's persecution and their ill behavior, their meanness, their rudeness? Some people would have even said, it makes no sense. Are you not making matters worse when you begin condoning behavior like that? Are you not giving it permission? Well, Jesus' question doesn't really bring into it the idea of the challenges. That's not the focus of the question. Listen to it again. If you love only those who love you, what reward do you have? The focus is the reward that comes from loving people who don't love us. Loving people who are hard to love. This passage in Matthew's gospel comes in a section of the Sermon on the Mount known as the antitheses. 6 units of scripture that all begin, you have heard that it was said, and then Jesus quotes an Old Testament law. Then he reinterprets it by saying, but I say to you. And this last antithesis, the one we're looking at today, sort of sums up the ones that have gone before it. Jesus says, you've heard that it has been said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies. Now, hold on that for a moment. Love your neighbor comes from Leviticus. It's in the Old Testament. It's part of the holiness code. It didn't mean what we mean by it today, like love your neighbor means love everybody. No, at that time it meant love your fellow Israelite. That is at least how it came to be interpreted. Love your fellow Israelite. So in another story, when a rich young ruler says to Jesus one day, and who is my neighbor? He wasn't being contrary. He was answering a very good question. That's what his religion taught him to ask. Who am I obligated to love? But it's the second part of this, you have heard that it is said, that raises questions. Hate your enemy. That's not in the Bible. That's not Old Testament law. That had become accepted by religious tradition. In Jesus' day, it perhaps was looked at as good as Scripture. Of course, it's okay to hate your enemy. If you are to love your fellow Israelite, it's okay to hate those who do not stand for the values of God as we do. Isn't it interesting how religious traditions can make it acceptable to hate? But in all fairness, people who lived by that tradition in Jesus' day would have said, no, wait a minute. This does not mean we hate people. It means we hate behaviors. Kind of like folks today who say, we are to love the sinner but hate the sin. Well, let me ask you, how easy is it for you to love and hate at the same time? Especially when you're talking about the same person. Well, we really don't need to debate the merit of this ancient law and tradition because Jesus handles this for us. He says, but I say to you, you shall love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you. Doesn't that make it better now? Oh, doesn't that make it an easier way to live? Isn't that a much more appealing rule of life? Let me ask you to do something for a moment. I want you to close your eyes. And you really do need to close your eyes to do this simple little exercise. And if you're watching from home right now, I want you to do that. Wherever you're sitting, wherever you are, close your eyes right now. And I want you to picture somebody who has hurt you. And maybe that is somebody in recent days or months. And the reason it hurts is it's probably somebody you trusted, somebody you love, somebody you've cared about, but they said something, they did something, and it has really wounded you. It's not resolved. Maybe you are calling to memory someone you've not thought of in a long time, somebody from way back, preferably somebody still living, but someone where there is an unresolved wound. They did something that hurt you so deeply, and I want you to picture them right now. Now let me ask you, how does it make you feel to picture that person? What's going on in your body as you picture them? And as you keep picturing them, let me ask you, will you show love to that person? Open your eyes. If you are saying right now, I don't know, then you get it. You understand this teaching of Jesus. If you're squirming and going, well, but what does it mean to love somebody in that instance? Then you feel the significance of Jesus' teaching, because this is not easy stuff. This is demanding. This is difficult. What exactly does it mean to love a person who really hurt us? That's what we're thinking about for a few minutes. One of the first things we can consider about this idea when it comes to loving an enemy is that we don't have to like in order to love. Martin Luther King Jr. said, we should be happy that Jesus did not say, like your enemies. It's almost impossible to like some people. Like is a sentimental and affectionate word. How can we be affectionate toward a person whose avowed aim is to crush our very being and place innumerable blocks in our path? How can we like a person who is threatening our children and bombing our homes? This is impossible. But Jesus recognized that love is greater than like. And indeed it is. This love is the very love of God Jesus is talking about. A love that sends the sun upon the good and the evil. A God who sends the rain upon the just and the unjust alike. Why? Because God's willing to suffer us. God will tolerate what is unloving within us, and God refuses to quit loving. This is agape love. It is not love that comes from a feeling or an emotion. It is an act of the will. So clearly, when we think of what does it mean to practice it, one of the things it means to practice this kind of love is not repaying in kind the treatment we have received. When we love an enemy, we refuse to ridicule the other. We refuse to belittle, berate, and seek their ruin. We refuse to let our enemies make us like them, because we understand that the best retaliation to a wrong that is done to us is to keep loving. To keep loving. And that is what our world needs. It's to keep loving, to practice the wisdom of the ancient proverb. If your enemies are hungry, give them bread to eat. And if they're thirsty, give them water to drink. For you will heap coals of fire on their heads, and the Lord will reward you. Don't repay in kind. Something else it means to love an enemy is not to cancel out. Not canceling the other. This is a big deal today, isn't it? I mean, we live in a cancel culture. That when we hear things that go against our values, our beliefs, that offend us, you're canceled right away. And folks, I'm not talking about television shows. I'm talking about Facebook. I'm talking about Instagram. I'm talking about Twitter. I'm talking about the way we deal with people whom we don't like. We unfriend, we block, we remove them. It's just easy to cancel and to be done with a relationship. Now, I know I'm sounding real judgmental in saying this, but it's hard. It's hard. It's hard doing that, isn't it? Because all of us have only so much emotional energy to deal with in life, so much turmoil that we deal with. It's just easier to, I'm not going to talk to that person again. So, we do need to remove ourselves sometime. But there is a difference between removing ourselves and canceling somebody out. You never know when a string of connection, and that's all I'm talking about, just a string, wishing them a happy birthday, sending a Christmas card to say, I'm thinking about you, I hope you're doing it. You never know when just a string of connection will lead to a lifeline for somebody later on. And then Jesus makes very clear that what it means to love the enemy is to pray for the enemy, to pray for those who persecute us. If you really get this one, you're going to groan. Why don't you groan with me one time? Because this is not easy. It sounds easy. It sounds easy. It is not easy. It is easy to pray, for God's sake, let that person get what's coming to them. I mean, that's a prayer. That is a prayer. But it's not a prayer Jesus prayed. If you pray Jesus' way, you pray for the good of the other person. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because when you pray for another person's good, something happens to us. We begin to see the other as a human being. And what we know is that no human being is born to hurt. No human person is born to wound and lessen the humanity of another individual. You got to learn that stuff. And when somebody does that, something's broken in them. And when you see them as human beings, what you realize is I've done my stuff too. I need compassion. And this person who has become my enemy needs compassion as much as I do. And so prayer begins to change us and impact us. But that leads to the really big question, which is why? Why do this? Why love people who don't deserve our love? And one answer is because our world needs us to. Our world needs greater compassion. That's why we love this way. Our world needs people willing to do the courageous acts that stand against and reverse the flow of the tide of hatred and division in our society. But that's risky. In St. Patrick's Cathedral in Dublin, Ireland, there's a display called the Door of Reconciliation. It's a giant wooden door with a hole in the middle of it. It goes back to an event that happened in 1492, same year Columbus sailed for America. There were two feuding families in Dublin who got into a big fight one day. It became bloodshed very quickly, and one family got the upper hand on the other. So the other family ran for cover into the cathedral down in the basement. They locked themselves behind that door. The other family came and started pounding on the door. Open up, let's make peace. The family on the inside said, right. We open this door, you're gonna slaughter us. No, we need to make peace. So the family that was locked out cut a hole in the middle of the door, and you can see there the picture. And one of them took the risk of extending a hand through the door, knowing that the other people could cut the hand off. But instead, somebody on the inside grasped the hand and shook it. And then they unlocked the door and opened it. It is on display to this day to serve as a lasting reminder that reconciliation often means taking risks. It often means risking for the sake of reversing division. We all have to do this. At the 2020 National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C., a Harvard professor named Arthur Brooks was the keynote speaker. And at that event, he said the biggest crisis facing our nation is the crisis of contempt and polarization that's tearing our societies apart. And he called this crisis the greatest opportunity we have ever had as people of faith to lift our nations up and to bring our people together. And then he focused on what he called Jesus' subversive and counterintuitive command to love your enemies. Now remember, the president was sitting on one side, the vice president on the other, and a room full of Washington politicians. And he continued, how many of you love somebody with whom you disagree politically? I think laughter kind of broke out in the room at that point. Make it personal, my friends. Jesus didn't say tolerate your enemies. He said love your enemies. Answer hatred with love. And then this closing zinger. Ask God to give you the strength to do this hard thing, to go against your human nature, to follow Jesus' teaching. Ask God to take political contempt from your heart. Sometimes when it's just too hard, ask God to help you fake it. You know, that's legitimate. It's legitimate to fake it. Fake it till you make it. I tell you, sometimes I know I make loving way too hard because I wait to show love until I feel like loving. I wait to show love until somebody says, I'm sorry. I sit by my phone, it never rings. I stand by the mailbox, the card never arrives. I look at my email every day, no apology. I wait. Sometimes you fake it until you make it because you don't know. But when you just act upon the will and you show love anyway, that you will start to feel love again. And you never know that when somebody who doesn't deserve it is shown love, they will start to show love themselves. But there's another reason we do this. The reward in loving this way, in showing compassion this way, is not just for our world, The reward is we need to love this way. We need it. Listen to the reason Jesus gave in this passage for loving like this. He said, love your enemies so that, now watch this, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. Now, some people say, well, that sounds like Jesus is telling us we have to earn our status as children of God. That only when we love in this difficult way can we hope to being called children of God. But there are scholars who say, no, that misunderstands what Jesus is saying. What Jesus is actually saying is, let me tell you who you already are. You are children of God. So let's understand what it means to act that way. Back in the early 90s, there was this really silly comedy movie called King Ralph, starring John Goodman. And the movie begins with all of the members of the royal family, the extended royal family members, coming together for a rare photograph. But there's this electrical accident and they're all killed. So researchers have to go to work to find out who is the next in line to inherit the throne of Great Britain. And much to their surprise, they find that it's an American named Ralph Jones, who lives in Las Vegas and is a fired lounge singer. John Goodman plays the part. He finds out that he's actually royalty, even though he likes to go bowling and drink beer. He moves into Buckingham Palace, but he is way too boorish and uncouth to be the King of England. So his valet, Peter O'Toole, begins to coach him on what it means to act like royalty. That's what Jesus does for you and me. Jesus came to let us know we are royalty. We are children of the King of heaven and earth, and to show us what it means to act that way. And as difficult as it sounds like it is to love an enemy, Jesus shows us this is what we need. Because when we hold on to bitterness and resentment, it drags us down from our full identity. And what we need is to be made whole. The end of this passage has Jesus saying, do this so that you may be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. How many of you are perfect? That's what I thought. This is not about perfect behavior. The word perfect in Greek is a word teleos that means wholeness, completion. When we love this way, we become more whole as human beings because we don't keep in our soul things that erode our identity as children of God. Listen again to the words of Dr. King. I have decided to stick with love, for I know that love is ultimately the only answer to our problems. For I have seen too much hate to want to hate myself, because every time I see it, I know that it does something to the faces of others and their personalities. And I say to myself that hate is too great a burden to bear. I have decided to love. It may be a very selfish thing to do, but it's appropriately selfish to love this way. When Pastor Mindie and I got together some days back to work on this sermon, she relayed a story from her life. She said, I'm thinking about closing my sermon with this story. And when she told me, I said, Mindie, I had no idea. I had no idea that about your life. And I said, if you're okay doing this, I would like everyone in St. Luke's to hear your story. Listen to this.
Well, some of you know my story, but if you don't, I have been wrestling with this question that Jesus asked ever since I was a young child. My mom died when I was 2. She had cancer, and a few years later, my dad got remarried. And when he got remarried, he married someone who also had children, but who created a family dynamic where they were in and I was out, and that quickly devolved into a childhood full of emotional, spiritual, and social abuse. And this abuse really created these deep wounds in me that I carried to adulthood. It made me this very bitter and angry person. And so when I heard Jesus asking this question of, why can't you love your enemy? I thought, because it's impossible. It felt unfair that Jesus would ask me to love someone who had hurt me so deeply. I think one of the reasons it felt so impossible or so unfair is that I had a really skewed view of what this love toward a difficult person even looked like. For me, love meant restoration of the relationship. I mean, I heard that from everyone in my life. You just got to forgive your dad, let him back in. Life is short, you're going to have regret. But that never felt right to me. It never felt like it actually honored what I experienced and kept me safe going forward. But the thing that also didn't feel right was this inner state of bitterness, this inner state of darkness that I was cultivating. I was looking for Jesus in all of this fury that I was carrying around, and I felt that Jesus was saying, actually, there's a better way. There's a real love. You just got to start to heal. And so I did the work to start healing, and it was long, it was difficult, but as I started healing, what I realized is that healing did not mean we were gonna have a restored relationship. It did mean reconciliation, but it was a reconciliation inside myself. Pastor Rob talked about that risk that comes with the act of reconciliation. And sometimes I think that risk can be just as scary when it's the work we're doing as when we're talking to another person. Because anger, when we carry that around, anger is energizing. Anger motivates us. Anger provides a really nice cover for the tender, vulnerable things that we might be feeling. But it's only when we get under that anger and see what's beneath that we can actually start to cultivate that love that Jesus talks about. Now, the story doesn't end there, because as I started to heal, as I maybe reached even a place of healing, if you had asked me what the thing I was the most afraid of in the world was, I wouldn't have told you any of the typical fears. I would have told you the thing I was most scared of facing was seeing my dad in real life again. Because I was just sure if that happened, I was sure if we were in the same room, then all the good work that I did would come undone in an instant. And I was sure, as much as I believed in God's power, in God's love for me, I was sure that this was the one place of my life that not even God could touch. But then a couple years ago, I found myself face to face with that fear. My grandma had died, my dad's mom, and it was really important to me that I went to her funeral. We were pretty close when she was alive, and I knew that he would be there too. And as I went to that funeral, so afraid, so anxious, and as I stood right in front of my father, this person who had wounded me, what I expected to happen didn't. I gave him a hug. I made small talk with him. And maybe most importantly, I felt compassion. I didn't feel that fury and anger that I was so sure I was going to come face to face with. But Jesus was letting me love him. Now, I want to be so clear. We didn't restore our relationship going forward. We are still not in relationship with each other. But Jesus has taught me that sometimes loving the person who's difficult to love is more about what's happening in us, is more about what's happening between us and God than about what's happening between us and them. We don't always get to have that happy ending where we have restoration, where we become friends again or in regular communication. But what we can have, no matter what those circumstances look like, is an opportunity to be people whose lives are anchored in love, anchored in forgiveness, anchored in compassion, because that is the kind of life that Jesus wants us to have and that Jesus makes possible.
There's a lot I like about Mindie's story. That first of all, as a pastor, things aren't always perfect. We're people. But it's also a story that doesn't have such a beautiful bow on the end of it, where just because she's a person of faith, it all comes together and all the people in her life are restored. It's more like a ... instead of a period and an exclamation point. It's a ... Story's not finished. You don't know what that might lead to, but there's an opening for it to lead to more than what it was. And that's what happens when we love in such a way. We simply give a ... to things. We give a future in which God can do something. But when we cancel people out, when we return hurt for hurt, we close that future. We give God room to work. Because God is a God who suffers us. God offers God's self to us and God's Son, Jesus Christ. In receiving communion, we recognize we are human beings who have caused wounds too. I betcha there are people out there we don't even know. If they're asked to close their eyes and picture somebody, they might be picturing us. And we don't even realize it. It's us coming to their mind. It's us making their hands tremble, going, I don't know what I would do if I got to face them again. It's us too in need of forgiveness. I want you to think about in a moment when we're all invited to share this together, what happens when we take communion? We ingest the bread and the cup. It gets inside of us. The love of Jesus gets into our bloodstream. It goes to our brains. It gets into our hearts. It goes into our hands in which we can act and show love. Jesus empowers us to show the love he shows us. So we remember how on the night Jesus was betrayed, he took bread and blessed it and broke it and gave it to his disciples. And who was one of the disciples at the table with him? His name was Judas, who betrayed him. The night he was betrayed, he took bread and broke it and gave it to them, including Judas, and said, take and eat. This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.
He also took the cup. He poured it and passed it and said, this is my blood, which is shed for the forgiveness of all of sins. As often as you drink of this, do this in remembrance of me. As we come, we want to remind you that as a United Methodist Church, we practice an open table, which means regardless of where you are spiritually, we invite you into this moment to experience the love of God. We invite those of you who are online. This is a great time for you to get your elements so that you can partake in this as well. You will be guided by your ushers, and as you come forward, one server will hand you a piece of gluten-free bread, and then another server will give you a cup of juice. You can partake of that when you are ready. And just know that if you are unable to come forward, just wave a hand and one of our servers will come and find you. Again, just know that regardless of where you are loved, and we hope that you experience that in this moment. We ask our servers to now come forward as we will serve them, and then our ushers will come and guide you to come forward.